So yesterday, Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks wrote an article for the Wallstreet Journal explaining what he thinks Joe Biden needs to do if he wants to win over progressives. You can see here how Biden can win over progressives. You can see there Cenk Uygur. Now, he actually opens the article quite interesting, which is that he actually opens it by addressing Joe Biden's supporters as opposed to Joe Biden himself or Joe Biden's campaign. He says, 1, stop insulting us. 2, stop blaming us for losing an election you haven't even lost yet. And 3, actually ask us what we want. And I think that that third one there is actually the most important one, which is that one of the things that we're seeing from a number of liberals supporting Joe Biden, even by the way, the Joe Biden campaign itself, is that they seem to think that they can tell progressives what progressives actually want. Just one example, when you look, for instance, at who the Joe Biden campaign is considering when they talk about VP, well, when you ask them, well, who are the progressives they're looking at, you hear names like Katie Porter or maybe Elizabeth Warren at the far end of things. But when I ask progressives, and I ask, Bernie Sanders supporters, everyday progressives, who they want to see when it comes to VP, I hear other names. I hear names more like Nina Turner or Barbara Lee. And so it's not quite clear that who the, sort of liberals say are progressive, are the same people that progressives say are progressive. And I think that this is leading to a kind of miscommunication, a kind of confusion. And I think that this is a really big issue because I really think it can lead to a kind of resentment where they do start blaming us for losing an election. And they do start insulting us because they're like, hold on, we gave you a unity task force with AOC as co-chair for the climate stuff. Why are you upset? Why are you saying that Joe Biden isn't progressive? Look at all these overtures that we've done. And so I think that it leads to this serious disconnect where liberals think that they can tell progressives what progressives actually want. But I think that this actually goes to a deeper point and a deeper concern, which is that for whatever reason, liberals for the longest time have always thought, or at least said that they thought, that they are in fact progressives or they are in fact leftist, but that, it's just a disagreement on strategy. What? Me? We want the same things. We just disagree on how to get there. We saw Hillary Clinton last time around saying things like, I'm a progressive who likes to get stuff done. And so the difference, they say, between leftists and liberals is just a matter of strategy of how you get there. But actually, I think that the difference is much more substantive than that and much more serious. And actually, I'm going to sort of get to that by sort of going through, explain that point by going through Cenk's article here. And so, one of the next points that Cenk makes here is that the reality, I'll just sort of quote here, the reality is that younger voters know the substantive difference between candidates and insist on the one who better matches their preferences. That's how elections are supposed to work. But the Democratic establishment calls these things a purity test. You talk about things like Medicare for all or a Green New Deal. But like, hold on, this is a purity test. Medicare for all isn't the only way, they argue, to get to expanded access for healthcare. But that's the disagreement. That's the problem. Progressives and leftists are not necessarily interested exclusively in expanding access to healthcare. Look, do I want expanded access to healthcare? Yeah, sure. But what do you mean by that? The problem is that leftists are interested in a single-payer healthcare system. Progressives are interested in a single-payer healthcare system like Medicare for all, as opposed to merely just expanding access. Because leftists and leftists and progressives are interested in getting rid of the fact that there are private interest when it comes to healthcare. They say that's a problem, right? Like there's a debate between leftists whether or not we would support Medicare for all or whether or not we want a kind of NHS system. That's the debate which leftists have. And so liberals to come around and say, well, hold on, we're just trying to figure out ways in which we can expand the market for healthcare to ensure that it covers more people. The government's role is just to manage the economy and make sure that the economy is efficiently distributing resources when the economy is explicitly and specifically defined as a capitalist instrument. There's a disagreement. There's a substantive disagreement, and it's not merely a disagreement over strategy. And so that's why sort of liberals and sort of the Democratic establishment say this is just a purity test. You're saying that this is the only way to expand access to healthcare. But the point is, we want more than just expanding access to healthcare. And I think that actually this is really well this distinction is really well illustrated here as Cenk Uygur explains that the real thing that progressives have always been critical of, the real thing that progressives have always been interested in, is getting money out of politics. So here's Cenk Uygur now. What do we want? If you ask, you might find out. For instance, that Justice Democrats has only one litmus test, and it isn't Medicare for all or a Green New Deal. It's rejecting money from corporate PACs. Why? Because the central issue in U.S. politics is corruption. Now, I think that this is actually, in some sense, I think that this point, you might be able to debate the specifics of the wording there, but I think that in general, this is right, which is that leftists have always been more interested in reframing the relationship between the government and the market. For instance, you hear Bernie Sanders. How did he always argue for his policies? He would open up by asking us a question. He would say, why is it the case that in the wealthiest country in the world, 500,000 people, 500,000 people sleep out on the streets every single night? Why is it the case that in a country in which Jeff Bezos is on track to becoming the world's first trillionaire, is it the case that there's $1.5 trillion of student loan debt, right? You hear Bernie Sanders opening it up as a question. And I think that one of the things that Bernie Sanders was trying to do there was not just point out corruption in government, point out, look at these individuals taking money into government, taking money from corporations and then being bribed. Bernie Sanders was also sort of goading us to try to think about the market as a political instrument. Think about market decisions as the result of political actions, as opposed to merely just, oh, this is what the market did and there's not really much that we can do about it. Because that's one of the things that neoliberals oftentimes do. I mean, in many respects, neoliberalism just is, almost in many respects, the definition of neoliberalism is an ideology which attempts to offload political and, sort of very difficult, very serious political decisions onto the market. So we sort of privatize, we privatize public transportation. We privatize these various, functions which used to be government functions. What does that have the effect of doing? Well, the sort of effect of that is that no sitting politician has to make difficult decisions about who gets and who does not get, right? Those are the kind of questions, those are the kind of decisions which can lead to someone losing their seat, losing their position in office. So they offload those questions onto the market and say, well, the market decides. And then when they're criticized and say, why is public transportation crumbling? They say, well, hold on, if we raise ticket fares, the problem is that fewer people will go, and then the more people will take Uber, and then actually less money is going to come in, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you ask them, well, why is it the case that African Americans are disproportionately marginalized and don't have nearly as much access to transportation services in our country? They say, well, look at the ticket prices, look at the ticket fare. And it allows politicians to dodge and to avoid being asked very serious and legitimate political questions about these issues. Because sort of the difference between liberals and leftists, at least one of the differences, there are multiple differences, but at least one of the differences is that leftists see the market and market action as finally political questions. After all, by the way, who's going to enforce a contract, right? At the end of the day, it's going to be the government. So at the end of the day, leftists tend to argue that all market transactions, all market actions are in some sense a political question. Bernie Sanders was trying to get the American people to think for the first time that maybe these questions of, the fact that there's 500,000 people sleeping on the streets is a political decision and a political action which is possibly avoidable. And so progressives really sort of honing in on money in politics is, I think, the right action. I think that that's the right way to go. And I think that Cenk is definitely onto something when he targets corporate PAC money. Moving into this next section here, this bothers political elites the most. They pay lip service by opposing the Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling, the easiest possible thing to do in politics. But if you tell them taking corporate PAC money is corruption, then they turn around and despise you. They almost all take money, so it feels like a personal insult. And so they have two choices: stay offended or change. And I think that this is really right and really, really important. One of the points that I always try to point out to people when I'm talking about the issue of money in politics is that it's not always the case that it's ending up, sort of changing people's minds. Do I think that that oftentimes happen? Like, a politician gets gets money from a particular corporation and then they change their position. I think, yes, that does happen oftentimes. But even if it didn't, even if politicians have their views unaffected, it's still corrupting to democracy, which is that, consider, for instance, an example where some representative supports some farm bill because they legitimately hold this view and they think that it's the right position to hold. Well, in that instance, imagine, then some farm industry which stands to benefit from that sends that person money, money because they're like, look, this person supports the policies that I, support, and so let me send them money. What that means is that then that person is harder to beat in an election. So if you try to primary that person, if you try to challenge that person in an election, that candidate that, who supports that farm bill genuinely and in their heart supports that bill, is more difficult to beat and has just more resources sort of behind them, right? And so that can lead to a situation where the people might disagree with the candidate on that particular issue, but because that candidate is getting money, it's more difficult for sort of democracy to actually influence influence the thing. So it's actually corrupting to democracy, even if it's not actually changing people's minds, sort of corrupting them personally, right? Like, and so I do think that it's sort of a mistake for a number of corporate Democrats to come out and say, oh, well, and get offended, get triggered by, pointing out corruption when, like, it's clearly obvious. It's corrupting to democracy. And yes, you are a bad person for taking corporate money. You just are, because what you've done is degraded and undermined democracy. What you've done is put your career, right? You've put your sort of chances of getting elected ahead of the American people. You've put your elected office, your sort of advancement, your interest in winning re-election ahead of the interest of your constituents. So I do think that it's a problem. I think that it's naturally corrupting democracy. I do. Now, what does Cenk Uygur sort of propose that Joe Biden do about all this? Well, it goes on here to say that saying that you want to get money out of politics is meaningless, saying that you want to make it your top priority and that you should be judged as a failure if you can't get it done. Now, that's a little bit more serious. Democrats should promise to pass Senator Kirsten Gillibrand's Clean Election Act, which would give Americans $600 democracy dollars each cycle to donate to federal candidates, and then from there they should move on to fight for a constitutional amendment to get public financing of elections. That's the same amendment, by the way, which Mr. Biden favored 23 years ago. And I think that that's right. I think that that's definitely on the right track, on the right path to what Joe Biden would need to do if he wants to start winning over some progressives. Now, obviously, you watching this, you're going to have different standards than the other person watching this, and you're going to have different standards than me. We're all going to disagree on what exactly it would take, how far Joe Biden needs to do in order to, sort of win over progressives. So I don't want to really have that debate, because oftentimes what ends up happening is, you state what it would take to win over you, and then, I state, and so we end up in just sort of arguing in circles. But I think that we can all agree that if Joe Biden could seriously commit and said, look, in my first, 100 days, I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing, and I'm going to call on and call out Democrats who take corporate PAC money. If Joe Biden turned around and started doing that and said, I'm not going to be taking corporate PAC money, I can guarantee you it would win over more progressives than if he didn't otherwise. So I think that Cenk Uygur is at least right to say that this is moving in the right direction, and that Joe Biden would be making serious progress in actually extending a real olive branch to progressives if he abandoned taking corporate PAC money, and if he called out other Democrats who took corporate PAC money and called on called to pass Kirsten Gillibrand's act, and then called to move towards public financing of elections. So I do agree with Cenk to that extent. Now, obviously, like I was saying, it's a broader debate whether or not it would win over you or whether or not it would win over all progressives. Look, you're never going to win over everybody, but I think that it would go a long way, and I think that it's really important. But again, broader lesson here that I'm trying to make here, which is that liberals and leftists do disagree, and the idea that liberals seem to have of themselves that they are leftists who just disagree on strategy is incorrect and mistaken. And the fact that liberals don't take enough time to study and listen to and really understand leftist thought is precisely why Joe Biden is struggling to win over the left, because he doesn't understand us. Anyway, that's just my thoughts about it. You can let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. But for now, if you did like this video, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.